The following is a presentation of New Worker Radio. The views and opinions expressed therein do not necessarily represent those of WZML, its staff, or management.
Hello, and welcome to New Worker News on WZML 92.9. My name is Manolis, bringing you national and international updates from a worker's perspective. The elections in the United States concluded on November 6th to elect the President, Vice President of the country, state representatives of the House and Senate, members of state Supreme Courts, several local legislatures, and municipal governments of various states. All 435 seats in the House of Representatives were up for election. 34 of the 100 Senate seats were contested. At the state level, 11 states held gubernatorial elections. Dozens of local referendums were conducted alongside elections for various local offices, including judges, mayors, council members, and sheriffs. Votes were also cast for statewide ballot measures such as abortion, education, the privatization scheme of school choice, recreational drug policies, minimum wage, sick leave, and unionization policies. The electoral process was marked by government intervention favoring the Democratic Party and the demagogy from both major factions of the bourgeoisie. Candidates Donald Trump and Kamala Harris ran dirty campaigns which saw an election cycle rake in an obscene $15.9 billion from big business to determine the outcome. Hundreds of capitalists and monopolies poured millions into the campaigns of both candidates. Both parties' strategies are firmly aimed at reinforcing U.S. monopolies and fostering international imperialist alliances to compete with Beijing, all while continuing their unyielding support for the genocidal state of Israel. Regardless of their differences, both candidates remain fully committed to managing and upholding the capitalist system. Behind the intense inter-bourgeois struggle, we find the contradictions of the rotten system itself, in times when the primacy of the USA in the imperialist system is threatened. The U.S. fights tooth and nail to maintain its position at the top, while U.S. capital seeking to confront its rival, China, which is claiming new leads in more and more fields. This fierce antagonism between the blocs of imperialist powers and the intense competition between them marks this election cycle. Despite all the efforts of the bourgeoisie, their agents in the labor movement, and opportunist forces to portray the struggle between Harris and Trump as a battle between fascism and democracy, we reaffirm that both candidates represent a continuation of anti-popular policies. The independent and third-party candidates have merely served to bolster the campaign of Donald Trump and mislead the working-class movement. These so-called alternative political options, especially those that claim to be socialist, only step forward to attempt to hand the revolutionary forces banners from foreign bourgeoisie. Under both Republican and Democratic administrations, at every level, from federal to state to local, the people of this country have been sacrificed on the altar of profit. They have been abandoned in the face of hurricanes, floods, and fires, with hundreds of lives lost across Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, California, Texas, and beyond. Both parties have funneled hundreds of billions of dollars into packages to support U.S. monopolies and fuel imperialist conflicts, from the Middle East to Ukraine to Taiwan. Both have presided over the gutting of social rights, education, healthcare, housing, utilities, while enacting barbaric policies. They have governed amid surging costs for basic necessities, eroding the incomes of workers and their families. Both have saddled the people with crushing taxes, only to see them siphoned off to bail out banks and monopolies in times of crisis, or otherwise pouring them into expanding the military capabilities of the bourgeois state and its imperialist alliances. Both parties have presided over widespread poverty and millions of homeless. Both have been complicit in and aided crackdowns on workers and popular struggles, presiding over administrations that leave millions of black and Latino workers facing racism, police brutality, and violent discrimination. The victims of these two imperialist parties are not only here at home, but extend to all peoples around the globe, who have suffered from their interventions, wars, massacres, coups, and sanctions. The confrontations between the two parties, which have alternated power for more than a century, have nothing to do with the interests and needs of the great majority of people. Our country has all the keys necessary to unlock the emancipation of the working masses, and they must be ripped from the hands of the exploiters. The results are clear. Donald Trump has once again won the presidential election in a decisive victory. His victory is born out of a deep dissatisfaction with the anti-popular policies of the Biden administration. Trump is clearly the preferred candidate for a faction of the U.S. ruling class that insists on prioritizing the strategic adversary, that is China, a focus that traces back to the Obama administration, and undermining the growing China-Russia alliance. This faction of big capital is determined to confront China more aggressively to revive the fading glory of American business. Among Trump's backers this election cycle are a plethora of billionaires, including Elon Musk, Rupert Murdoch, Tim Mellon, the billionaire banker, Palantir Technologies, Peter Thiel of PayPal, Johnson & Johnson, Kenneth Griffin of Citadel LLC, Richard and Elizabeth Uihlein, and Jeff Yazd. Trump has not only garnered support from this segment of the bourgeoisie, but has also, since 2016, won the confidence of the market and investors who view in him as a boon to investments. This is why his first victory triggered a market surge, as investors shifted toward backing Trump's economic agenda. Although he has yet to take office, we're seeing a similar trend as in 2016. S&P 500 futures have already jumped over 2%. While the political establishment largely leaned toward a Harris victory, the financial system viewed a Trump win as equally favorable and likely just as profitable. The previous Trump administration secured the trust of corporate leaders by slashing the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, echoing his plans for a new term. Playing on the cultural backwardness still plaguing U.S. society, Trump has leveraged the deep distrust among the people for the political system amid worsening social problems and policies that offer no relief from the deeper cuts to the incomes of the majority of people. To this end, immigration has been a focal point of his administration and will remain so in the next one. In his first term in 2016, Trump introduced a series of anti-immigration policies aimed at fulfilling his campaign promises of mass deportations. A key example was the administration's Migrant Protection Protocols, or the so-called Remain in Mexico policy, which forced asylum seekers to return to Mexico while awaiting their U.S. immigration court hearings. Trump's scapegoating of immigrants and reactionary rhetoric have remained consistent. There is no doubt that such policies will intensify in his new term. Despite all their talk and opposition to Trump, the Biden administration did not repeal this policy. Instead, they used it to deport thousands of asylum seekers to the southern border, where they left vulnerable to the Mexican National Guard and organized crime. We cannot forget that Trump's last government presided over an escalation of far-right violence and racism. The eruption of the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020, which were met with militaristic crackdowns, and the loss of millions of lives due to his administration's failure to effectively curb the COVID-19 outbreaks. Despite the slogan of End the Wars, the Trump administration proved as brutal as the Biden-Harris administration, signing off on over $110 billion in arms sales to Saudi Arabia, propping up the murderous Israeli state, and launching bombings in Syria to confront Assad's government. His administration rattled sabers with North Korea and began funneling military and economic aid to Ukraine. Despite the populist rhetoric, his administration was no less complicit in the barbaric machinery of war and repression, which are inevitable results arising from the capitalist system. Throughout this election cycle, Donald Trump has campaigned on a return to common sense policies, a pretext for vast privatization schemes. He has vowed sweeping reforms to immigration, voting, and the economy, among other areas. A new Trump administration would likely roll back Biden's reforms, introduce even more favorable tax policies for monopolies, intensify the crackdown on immigration, ramp up aggressive confrontations with China and Russia, continue backing the murderous Israeli state, and without a doubt take a chainsaw to the incomes of the working masses. Among other things, Trump has promised to stimulate the U.S. economy by further strengthening trade protectionism with less emphasis on the green economy. The Communist Workers' Platform will unyieldingly fight against the Biden administration and from January 20th, 2025, against Donald Trump, because both represent the interests of the exploiting capitalist class. There is an urgent need for the reconstitution of the Communist Party in our country, for the working class alternative that we have lost. There is a deep necessity for the only political option that is capable of strengthening its ties with the popular struggles, with the workers, working women, the youth, students, migrants, indigenous and other oppressed peoples, and the fighting organizations of the working class in order to lead the forces needed for the overthrow of this rotten system which breeds so much misery. The situation we find ourselves in today is one where the revolutionary workers' movement is in shambles, resulting from the ideological and political degeneration of the class-oriented forces. The domination of opportunism has left the proletariat unarmed in the face of capital's attacks. Nevertheless, recent workers and student struggles, along with the Palestinian liberation movement, represent emerging class-oriented forces that have the potential to be rallied in the fight for social revolution. The Communist Party is the only force capable of opposing the major blocs of the bourgeoisie in an anti-capitalist and anti-monopoly direction for the victory of the working class. We stand in solidarity with all those who rejected the quagmire of the lesser evil, many of whom are aware that the Democrats and Republicans are no way out. It is a good prospect for the workers and people who refuse to be trapped in the games of the ruling class. Shoulder to shoulder with the proletariat, fighting every day, the party will be built. A better future is possible. That is one in the ranks of the Communist Party, where our destiny is in our own hands.
We'll be right back with more of New Worker News here on 92.9 FM WZML. But I want to remind you that every day throughout this country, workers are subjected to injustices and humiliation at the hands of the capitalists, from unpaid wages to mass layoffs. So we at New Worker understand the tyranny that the workplace is for workers. This is why we fight to expose these injustices. Only through militant organization of the working class can we stand toe-to-toe against the bosses. So this is why we want to hear from you, the listener. Are you having issues at work? Bosses cutting your hours or wages? Are you or your fellow workers' safety being thrown out of the window in the name of ever-increasing profit? Well, you are not alone. So reach out to us to tell your story. You can anonymously send an email or even a voice memo to cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that is cwpusa@protonmail.com. And check us out online at newworker.us. And now back to New Worker Radio, only here on 92.9 FM WZML.
Back in September, bipartisan support led to the passing of the Countering the People's Republic of China Malign Influence Fund Authorization Act. The act was led by the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party and sponsored by Republican Andy Barr. The Select Committee was formed during the Biden administration by the House of Representatives back in January 2023, using the fact that it was controlled by the Republican majority. Despite this, its initiatives have received broad bipartisan support, demonstrating the unity of the ruling class to confront its main competitor, China, in all fields. One example being that the act mentioned here has authorized $325 million annually for the period of 2023 to 2027 to combat malicious Chinese influence. The bill defines the following actions as malignant influence in relation to the Communist Party of China and the governance of the People's Republic of China. 1. The erosion of a free and open international order. 2. The advancement of an alternative, repressive international order that strengthens the hegemonic ambitions of the Communist Party of China and the People's Republic of China and is characterized by blackmail and dependence. 3. Undermining the national security and sovereignty of the United States or any other state. 4. Eroding the economic security of the United States or other states, including corruption and economic extortion. What is particularly interesting is that the USA itself actually violates all 4 points. 2 current examples of point 1 are the embargo against the Republic of Cuba and the support of the Israeli genocide in Palestine. Every year since 1992, the UN has expressed its contempt for the U.S. embargo against Cuba. With a few exceptions, the only supporter of the USA in maintaining the embargo is Israel. The situation is similar with Israel's genocide, which finds great political support in the UN and its Security Council in the form of vetoes on ceasefire resolutions. In both cases, the international order agrees on how to act, but the USA appears to be above the international order and skillfully ignores it. Point 2 does not even try to hide the hypocrisy of the USA. They clearly speak of an alternative international order. This is tongue-in-cheek for an alternative to the international order led by the USA or NATO. The United States is violating Point 3 in the 21st century primarily, but not only, through the war on terrorism in Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, etc. Point 4 speaks of economic blackmail. The USA also commits economic blackmail against many capitalist states. They themselves would probably call these sanctions against authoritarian regimes. A concrete example would be the Google ban against the Huawei Group. This should be seen as nothing other than a clear escalation between the imperialist blocs of the USA and China. The purpose of this propaganda is to make the population ready for war, both militarily and economically. This was also the case with the oil and gas embargo against Russia, which has only transferred higher costs onto the people of the United States. This month, we remember the Great October Socialist Revolution of 1917. The victory of the October Socialist Revolution in 1917 proved that capitalism is not invincible. The existence of the Soviet Union in the 20th century illuminated that we can build a higher organization of society without exploiting man by man. That the wheel of history can turn forward in the direction of social liberation. Some of the achievements of the Soviet Union in meeting the basic needs of workers include eliminating unemployment and energy poverty, ensuring housing, free health, and high-level education, access to high-level cultural creation, all of which, despite decades, cannot be guaranteed by capitalism today. Capitalists can never ensure them. One could talk for hours about the jump to the rapid electrification of the vast expanse of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, the transformation of society into a war industry for the needs of the Second World War and the invasion of the Nazi forces, the conquest of space with Sputnik and the cosmonauts Yuri Gagarin and Valentina Tereshkova. The size of the leap in the development of the productive forces compared to capitalism can be understood if we look at the conditions that separated pre-revolutionary Russia from the powerful capitalist states of the time, such as the USA, Britain, and Germany. If we consider the disastrous consequences of the First World War on Russian soil and the fact that the successes of the Soviet Union were achieved in conditions of imperialist encirclement, counter-revolutionary internal subversion, and overt imperialist interventions. If we think about how development was ensured in capitalist countries with the increase in the degree of exploitation, lines of the unemployed, and employer terrorism. The history of the Soviet Union illuminates the possibility, necessity, and supremacy of a higher form of organization of society in which the purpose of production, the character of power and property, and the role of the working class, workers in general, are radically changed. From the hands of the bourgeoisie, the dictatorship of capital, power passes into the hands of the working class, that is, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Capitalist ownership of the means of production is abolished by their socialization, which means we move to social ownership of the means of production. The purpose of production changes, and the place of capitalist profit is replaced by the satisfaction of society's needs, which are constantly expanding. Workers from the background now move to the foreground of history and play an active role in making and controlling government decisions. In the Soviet Union, for the first time in history, it was demonstrated in practice the possibility of scientifically and uniformly planning the goals of production with the aim of comprehensively satisfying the needs of society. The possibility of improving the organization and coordination of the collective effort of millions of workers for the welfare of the majority was demonstrated. The history of socialist construction in the Soviet Union helps to understand that central planning is a relation of production and distribution determined by social ownership of the means of production in order to use them to satisfy expanding popular needs. It is a social relationship that expresses the radically different way in which workers are united with the means of production and with one another. In other words, the worker is no longer looking for a boss to sell himself to. The working class is now in power, playing a decisive role in what, how, and when something will be produced. In international news, following Trump's election victory, NATO, the EU, and Russia urgently assessed how the White House shift might reshape the global power contest. At a European summit, leaders stressed the need for Europe's strategic autonomy within the NATO framework. NATO's General Secretary, Mark Rutte, highlighted the growing threat from alliances among Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China, emphasizing this as a global issue. EU officials voiced concerns that Trump might scale back support for Ukraine, affecting NATO. Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, speculated Trump would withdraw U.S. backing for the Ukraine war, leaving Europe unable to sustain the conflict alone. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is rushing $9 billion in aid to Ukraine before Trump's inauguration. Putin, one day after the election of Trump, stressed that a multipolar world order is on the horizon. He proposed a neutral Ukraine as essential for peace, including barring Ukraine NATO membership and advanced weapon supplies. He argued that peace talks should reflect battlefield facts, not Kiev's demands, and cited referendums in annexed Ukrainian regions as mandates for Russian control. With Russia holding a fifth of Ukraine, nuclear threats remain in the balance. Putin is open to nuclear arsenal talks if NATO's British and French weapons are included, noting China's conditions for joining such discussions. China says that either the US and Russia should reduce their nuclear arsenals to the Chinese level, or the Chinese arsenal should grow to US-Russian levels. Moscow and Beijing recently strengthened their strategic cooperation, while Russia aims to deepen ties with India, a growing capitalist power and a major buyer of Russian defense technology. China's foreign ministry voiced support for peaceful resolutions to the Ukraine conflict, including Russia-US dialogue, while advancing its own security architecture for global peace and Ukraine. In late September, China and Brazil led the Friends of Peace group, gathering nations from the Global South and Global East to discuss Ukraine. Italian President Mattarella's visit to Beijing, accompanied by Foreign Minister Tajani, drew attention. Reports indicate he will explore with President Xi a new world order involving Russia, China, and the Global South as an alternative to the US-led West. Italian Finance Minister Giorgetti told the Senate that NATO's 2% GDP defense target is very ambitious and difficult to meet under EU fiscal constraints, forecasting Italy's defense spending at 1.5% in 2025, rising slightly to 1.61% by 2027. In this dangerous imperialist confrontation for the upper hand in Europe, the Baltic and Black Seas, the South Caucasus, and Central Asia, the threat of nuclear war is firmly on the table.
You've been listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML, your home for local, national, and international news, all from a working class perspective. New Worker News is the official organ of the Communist Workers Platform. If you're a worker, we would like to hear from you. You can reach us at cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that's cwpusa@protonmail.com. If you would like more news from a worker's point of view, visit us at newworker.us. You can find weekly articles on events happening all over the country and internationally. If you've enjoyed the program and wish to see more working class reporting, consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/New Worker. And thank you for listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML.